Welcome back to Ohio Counseling Conversations, the official podcast of the Ohio Counseling Association, bringing you updates and conversations from around the state. In today's episode, we're joined by the incredible Dr. Victoria Kress, a nationally recognized leader in the counseling field. We'll explore with her the intersection of mental health, advocacy, and political involvement, diving into how counselors can approach tough political conversations with clients and colleagues, and how to get involved and engaged in advocacy work. Dr. Kress also shares her insights on research, working with underserved populations, and the vital role counselors play in shaping mental health policy. I'm your host today, Dr. Marissa Cargill, a counselor in Northeast Ohio and counselor educator at the University of Akron. You're not going to want to miss this episode. Let's dig in. Welcome back to Ohio Counseling Conversations. We are so excited this morning to be joined by Dr. Victoria Kress. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're super excited to have you. And I know that there may have been some people who haven't had the opportunity to meet you. So please, to kick things off, tell us a little bit about yourself and what led you into the counseling profession.
Yeah, well, first, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I love the Ohio Counseling Association, and it's been critical to my personal and professional development. And I'm honored to be here talking with you all and our wonderful members today. So thank you. I am from Cleveland, Northeast Ohio. I grew up in Cleveland. I always say I'm a steel town girl. I grew up all around the steel mills. I've lived in multiple different places just surrounding the steel mills in Cleveland. And I wound up going to Baldwin Wallace University, which is up again in the Cleveland area. I studied psychology and sociology, and I minored in dance and biology. Then I wound up getting my master's degree in counseling at the University of Akron. And I also earned my PhD in counselor education and supervision at the
Mm.
University of Akron. And then went for a year early in my career. I was a professor at UNC Greensboro in North Carolina. And then I wound up coming back to Northeast Ohio because who can stay away from Ohio?
That's right.
I've been a professor at Youngstown State University now for about 22 years. So I've really kind of stayed here in the Northeast Ohio area. Early in my career, I worked as a counselor in a number of different settings. I worked in private practice. I worked in residential treatment with children who had been severely traumatized, abused, sex trafficked. I've worked in hospital emergency rooms. I've worked in hospitals. I've done diagnostic assessments for psychiatrists. I worked as a college counselor for 5 years and just really, really wanted to get a diverse array of real world counseling experiences
Hmm.
before I became a professor so that I could use those to train our future generations of counselors.
Yeah, it sounds like you really did get a wide mix of experiences throughout your career.
Yeah, I feel so
Yeah.
fortunate to have had those experiences. They really inform what I do as an educator. And I'm also the field placement coordinator at YSU, which is good because I'm in the trenches every day talking to supervisors and agency directors. So it keeps me really close to the pulse of what's going on out in our communities.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's a beautiful way to advocate when you've had so many different experiences that you really can speak to them in ways that are meaningful, both personally and professionally as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
And this is part of the reason we wanted to have you join us today, Vicky, is because you have been such an advocate, both on the state level and the national level. And we are heading toward election day. And that's a really big deal, I think, for any of us just as citizens, as humans in the world, right? But we wanted to get your take on like what your thoughts are for the current state of mental health like policy and advocacy as we're heading towards another election season.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for asking that. I do think it's a really important question, right? Look, I always say the personal is political. I
Mhm.
definitely am a feminist. I really espouse to relational cultural theory. I believe that everything that impacts us every day, right, from the toothpaste we use to the water we
Mhm.
drink, to the roads we drive on, all of these things are influenced by legislation, and it's
Mhm.
so, so important. So I really appreciate you asking that question. And certainly voting and election season is also a really important time that I think we all need to hit pause and think about the importance of voting, being a member, an active member of a vibrant democratic society. What does that look like? So I do think it's important. I think, I would encourage counselors to think about in terms of the voting process and how we vote and how we get involved, to really think about the our legislators and think about how they vote and think about issues that impact the counseling profession and
Mhm.
impact the people that we serve. I think that's critically important. To me, that's always one of the front and center things I'm thinking about is who is going to support my counseling family counselors,
Mhm.
right? I care so deeply about our profession, and that feels really important to me. Um, so that is super important. With all of that said, I hope I really emphasize how important I think voting is. But with all of that said, one of the things I say a lot is while elections are really important, they're just a piece of the pie. So I
Mhm.
think we can get really enthused about voting, particularly in presidential years. We can get really excited about that. Um, and we encourage people to vote in a presidential election year. We people will like share social media posts, right? Or maybe like
Mhm.
engage. And that's really important. But what's just as important is that every single day of the year and all years, we think about these things, right? And we think about the
Yeah.
political process and how it's important. So, for example, there are, non-presidential year elections that are just as important. Our state legislators just as important as our federal legislators and the president. Truthfully, in the big scheme of things, when I think about mental health policy and the things that impact us as counselors, the president doesn't play a super, super important role in that as the collective of our state and federal legislators and how they're
Mhm.
voting and thinking about different issues that impact us. So I don't know that all counselors understand that. It's what's going on here at the state level, what's going on in Congress and the Senate that tends to impact us in many ways much more meaningfully than the role of the president. So
Yeah.
helping people that listen really take that away. It's important to be involved in the voting process always. And again, not even just at the state level, but even local government. So, school boards.
Mhm.
School board,
Yeah,
really
definitely.
important, and those are political positions. I personally would like to see more of our counseling family run for school board positions and get involved because, wow, we can have a tremendous
Mhm.
impact on
Yeah.
children in our communities. We have so much to offer as counselors that we can share through school boards, and why are we not doing more of that? I would like to see us get involved. Get involved in your school board races, run for school board,
Yeah.
super important. It's just
Yeah.
not enough to go and vote or encourage people to vote. Like, that's not enough. Look, we know counselors and we know the people who we serve and we know what their mental health needs are in a very special way that legislators can't know. And so one of the things I really emphasize to counselors is we need to go and educate our politicians about who we are, what we do, about what are the needs of our communities, and what are ideas we have on the role that our politicians can play on and supporting the health of counselors and supporting the health of those we serve, right? Um,
Yeah.
and we can't know everything. Like, I'm always humbled by sitting with politicians and how much they know and ideas that they have that are things that I couldn't have thought about. So really what we need to do as counselors is be curious.
Mhm.
We need to be
Mhm.
curious. We need to be, we know who we are and what we do, and we need to connect with politicians and other folks to come up with creative solutions and ideas to solve some of these problems. So I find oftentimes counselors were intimidated by our politicians, but the most important role we can do is just educate them on who we are and what we do and get to know them. So, sitting down with them, "Hey, here's who we are. Here's what we do. Uh, what do you know about this? What questions do you have about this?" Saying to them, "What are the mental health, uh, policies and priorities that are of interest to you?
Mhm.
How can I share information with you that might be helpful?" So I think when counselors think about their role in the political process as being one of sharing their expertise, it feels much less intimidating than, "Oh, I have to go sit with legislators and tell them what to do," or, "No, this is a conversation," right?
Yeah,
And so I
speaking to
really
your expertise.
Exactly, and I really want counselors to feel empowered, to just feel comfortable sitting down with their legislators. I see how I've sat down with many counselors with legislators, and, very often it's the first time they've done that, and I see how scared and intimidated they are, but I wish I had understood early in the process. I don't have to be an expert. All I have to be an expert on is what I do, and we're all experts as counselors on what we do, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
this is a very long-winded way of me saying that I as while the voting process is really important, what's more important is that every day, 365, we are thinking about how we can stay connected with our legislators, you know? Another thing that's really important is that, the American Counseling Association and NBCC have electronic systems that we can, plug in our information, that we can add that information and the system will remember us, and we can go to their webpage and plug in our information and it will send out emails to our different legislators about
Yes.
different topics.
I've used that.
Yeah, it's
Yes.
so important. Look, emails aren't as important as these personal connections and contacts and getting to know our legislators or calling them. But just even something as simple as going to these websites, once a month and plugging in your information and shooting off these emails can be really helpful. I worked as the director of advocacy at NBCC for 2 years. And in that role, I was really focused on grassroots advocacy. So trying to get counselors to get excited about different legislative topics and engage with their legislators, and it was really, really challenging to get counselors to just send something as simple as an email. Very, very hard to get them just to pick up the phone and call. So it's not enough. It's not enough to vote. It's not enough to go on Facebook and share posts. Most of who we share our social media posts with are people who think exactly like we think.
Right.
Right?
Right.
It's not super useful. Certainly, social media can be used, effectively around different grassroots issues, but it's only gonna be effective if people stop sharing posts with people who already think like they do,
Mhm.
pick up the phone and they call their legislators or figure out how do we connect with other counselors to be unified? How do we connect with people, maybe even in other professions who have similar interests or passions, and we're on the same page with them? How do we unite and do intra within our profession advocacy, and then do interprofessional advocacy? So connecting with people outside of just our profession.
Yeah. What are the ways to engage people internally or externally, but making it more meaningful?
Yeah, exactly. So how do we, again, grassroots, how do we unite? How do we connect? How do we make change? So it's just not enough. It's not enough to vote. It's not enough to share some social media posts, right? We've got to come together, and we have to be effective. And that also means or like associations within our profession. I mean, the thing I've seen over the years is sometimes even within our own profession, we're not on the same page. We're not united. We're in Ohio. I always say Ohio for counselors is the land of unicorns and rainbows. Oh, there's no better state to be a counselor in than Ohio, period. I challenge anyone to take me on this. Look, we're a state that we require K-crop to become licensed for in state people. I was on the licensure board when we made this move, and it's one of the things I'm really proud of. That was a move that I believed helped elevate the profession, and I think it helped protect the people we serve, which is the primary charge of a licensure board. Like licensure board members don't have the bandwidth to be deciding the quality of programs and deciding if they meet KCREP standards. We need to let KCREP decide if a program meets KCREP standards. And so when I was in the licensure board, we made that move. And I think it was a really good move. And so now we have, I don't know what, 25 KCREP accredited programs. We have unification of standards. We have a very strong licensure law,
Mhm.
tax counselors. We can diagnose, treat, and assess and evaluate, and that's not question that hasn't been questioned in decades now because
Mhm.
of our tight licensure law, because we're unified, because we have Ohio Counseling Association, which is very strong, robust, healthy. We have this amazing annual conference where all counselors in Ohio can come together and connect around issues, and that really elevates us. So there's no better state to be a counselor in terms of unified standards, in terms of a sense of community and connection, in terms of our ability to come together and protect our profession, right?
Mhm.
There's no other state that has that. So, yeah, I can't overstate how fortunate we are to be Ohio counselors. But Marissa, we have to protect that. I've been using the word professional protection a lot.
Mhm.
Historically, we've talked about this professional identity and who we are, and I don't think that's up for debate. We, at this point in 2024, we know who we are. We know what we're about. The issue is there are many threats coming at us, and so we really need to get into protection mode and protect our profession
Yeah.
and what we do and who we are.
Yeah, that point is well taken, and I think, has been a sentiment that some folks have mentioned, but maybe not in those specific words with protection, but making sure that we are never stopping that advocacy piece and maintaining these walls around welcoming the people we serve in, but also making sure that we're protecting ourselves from maybe any threats to the profession.
Yeah. So Marissa,
Definitely.
I just have to say this because I think it's so important. One of Look, I've been a counselor now for 30 years, and one of the things that I'm very concerned about is I feel like our new generation of counselors doesn't understand our history. And
Mm.
if we don't understand our history, we're at tremendous risk. Look, when I became a counselor in 1995, we were on about 20% of insurance panels. 20%. Counselors had a hard time getting work. When I went to get my first counseling job, it took me months to get a job as a counselor, and it was really difficult, and I wound up having to do some jobs I didn't even wanna do just to get experience, to get an actual counseling job. We weren't recognized. We couldn't work in the Ohio Department of Corrections, for example. Only social workers and psychologists could. We couldn't work at hospitals. We were only on 20% of insurance panels. And now we sit here today, my students all get hired before they even graduate. We're on 100% of insurance panels. Thank goodness we finally got our Medicare reimbursement, decades of lobbying for that. So now we can be reimbursed by Medicare. It's a very different landscape. And Marissa, how did we get there? How did we get to this place of being recognized so broadly? Of my students are graduating, they're making $60,000, $70,000 a year graduating. When I first graduated, I made $20,000. How did we get to this place of such recognition, such respect? Was it because, legislators were like, "Oh, yeah, counselors, we need counselors at the table"? No. Was it because other professions like psychology, social work, were they like, "Oh, we really need to bring counselors to the table"? No. As a matter of fact, psychologists have historically fought us at every turn throughout the history of our profession. Absolutely not. We got to the table and got recognition because our founders, because
Mhm.
our leaders tirelessly gave of themselves.
Mhm.
for decades have been giving of themselves, fighting for us to get here. We can't It's completely disrespectful of them and the people who built this profession for our new generations of counselors to not continue to fight. We can't be soft, we can't be lazy. We have to fight
Right.
to maintain our place at the table. So this is what I'm saying is we have to understand our history and how we got here to really think about how fragile this is.
Mhm.
It's just
Mhm.
fragile, right? Like
Yeah.
there are ongoing threats on the horizon that we really need to be aware of. In some states, counselors still can't be reimbursed by Medicaid. So we have this tremendous shortage of providers, but yet there are still states where counselors can't be reimbursed by Medicaid.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
absolutely absurd, right?
Yeah.
And then we're struggling with our reimbursement rates still, right? So now we're at most of the tables, but we're not being paid appropriately. So I really think one of our next fights is increasing our reimbursement rates so that we can actually afford to feed our families, right?
Yeah.
Our lives.
Yeah. And so, like, the point is, we're here because of this involvement by people getting involved and fighting and really advocating. I think you've answered this pretty well, but like, if you could say in just a few words, like, what is like your idea or what are your ideas on how like political involvement and advocacy are so important for professional counseling and professional counselors?
Yes. The political involvement is so important because, as I said, legislation impacts everything that we do, right?
Mhm.
So we've seen what our profession looked like 30 years ago, where we couldn't practice, we couldn't get insurance reimbursement. A lot of people don't know that counselors were actually arrested and put in prison because we were practicing. We were simply practicing. Psychologists were calling, contacting the authorities. Like we were practicing out of our scope. We were doing things that we shouldn't be doing, right? So we need to remember this. The law impacts everything that we do. Without a Counselor Practice Act, like the laws that our state licensure board enforces, we wouldn't be a profession. Like we wouldn't even be here. So we really have to keep an eye to that. We need to stay connected with our legislators because they're the people who are voting on laws that impact um, laws that impact how we can practice, what we can do, what we can't do. The funding, a lot of it goes back to funding. Like where is money? Where are resources allocated that impact us and our ability to do different things, and really impact the people that we serve and their ability to access resources. So there's this issue of access to care, and that's money. That always boils down to money, and it's the legislators who are determining where the money is funneled and placed in terms of priorities, right? So we need to be part of the legislative advocacy process and advocating for our clients to be able to get access to care.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Switching gears a little bit, like how do you suggest professionals approach political conversations with their clients?
Yeah. This is really tricky. I do think the personal is political, but I really take my clients' lead on that. So I really
Mhm.
go with where they're going. So I
Mhm.
do believe engaging in the political process can be very healing and helpful to some people and part of their change process. But I really just take their lead on that. So, like for example, my background is in child abuse and trauma, and so say I'm working with a survivor who part of their growth healing process is advocacy around child abuse or trauma.
Mhm.
I will, have this conversation with them. What does that look like for you? What do you need to do with that? What feels important to you? Where or how do you want to get involved in a way that feels comfortable for you? So I really take my clients' lead on that. Not all of our clients are going to think the way we do about different political issues. And to me, as I said earlier, who you vote for is that's less of an issue as how you engage in the political process. So, having done a lot of legislative advocacy work with a lot of different people over the decades, I've seen some counselors think, well, this political party is my political party, and this political party is more sensitive to counseling issues and mental health issues, and so I just want to engage and be around folks from this party and talk to these legislators. But that's not actually a very good strategy, right? What's going to be more effective is connecting with the legislators who may be less supportive of the issues that we care about, right?
Mhm.
So, like as an example, Senator Sherrod Brown, he is, always supported counseling issues. Like anytime I've reached out to him, usually within a day, I've got co-sponsorship from his people. Like he consistently cares about the issues we care about. But like Senator Portman, he's no longer he's retired, but I could never get him and his people to support the issues that I wanted to get co-sponsorship around, like things like, for example, Medicare reimbursement for counselors. But what I would do is I knew that Senator Portman cared a lot about veterans issues. I knew he cared a lot about the opioid epidemic. And so when I would talk with him, I would take this angle of focusing on those issues because those issues tie directly to mental health, the people we serve, and what we do. And I was able to get some traction at times with his folks around that. So, we can't think, oh, like I just want to talk to the people who think the way that I think. We need to be actually going for people who may not be thinking the way we think and engaging them. It's a really effective legislative strategy. And I also
Mhm.
think it's important that as counselors, for all people, that we don't get siloed into like this party or that party. It's really not helpful. What's more important is figuring out how we can have conversations with all legislators around issues that we really care about and that we think are important. I think it's important as well to really approach political conversations from a place of kindness and curiosity.
Mm.
Sadly, that's become increasingly difficult because of social media, because of the divisiveness in our political system, which all politicians encourage. It
Yeah.
benefits all politicians for people to be fighting. Like it just gets people more entrenched in that political party, in their idea. But what it does is it really silos people against others, and it discourages conversations that could be really important. Look, at the end of the day, um, I love counseling. I love counselors. I love counseling. I care about counseling. It's my life. I've dedicated my personal life, my professional
Yeah.
to elevating this profession. So I'm less interested in like, oh, I'm just going to go throw a political sign in my yard and vote and throw up a couple social media posts. I'm much more interested in how can we have conversations with all people, right, and all legislators about topics that support people's mental health. And I will tell you, there's a lot of commonality there. It's something that I've
Yeah.
really come to appreciate. There is a lot more commonality there among politicians than you would think or realize, which is really exciting. So I'm curious about that commonality. Like a couple weeks ago, I was in DC. I was on the Hill. I was doing some legislative advocacy through the American Counseling Association, who was sponsoring a Day on the Hill event. And we were talking with a politician who has not historically voted in, in support of a lot of different mental health issues per
Mhm.
se. But look, he was completely lovely and he was completely engaged in the conversation. And he was really curious about parity issues, right? So, parity. In 2008, there was a Parity Act that went into place that said that third-party payers had to treat mental health and physical health the same in terms of reimbursement, which was huge for us. But at the same time, it's not really been enforced the way it should be.
Mhm.
And insurance companies find a lot of loopholes around this. And so last month, the Biden administration push forward with enforcing rules that would make third party payers have to enforce parity, which is completely wonderful for counselors. Anyway, he didn't know a lot about this. We were talking with him about it, and he was genuinely excited, genuinely interested, genuinely curious about it. Those are the kinds of conversations we need to be having more of, right? So we just have to be so careful with being black and white. We can't be pawns in the political game, and especially in election years, that's what we see happens, right? Politicians on both sides float issues that they think are really going to excite or titillate their base, but in my mind, those really detract from the conversations that we need to be having in terms of like, what are the mental health issues that matter? And I would really encourage us as a profession and individually as counselors to really stay focused on what we know. What
Hmm.
do we know and what can we speak to?
Yeah.
That's counseling.
Yeah.
That's mental health issues, right? Sometimes I see we can go a little sideways and get pulled into conversations that maybe don't relate directly to counseling and what we do and who we serve. Look, we need to be strength based. We know counseling. We should be speaking to counseling. We should be advocating for counseling issues. Certainly, there are all kinds of issues that impact our clients and their mental health. And as we have an expertise in those issues, I think it can be really helpful to speak to those issues. But most counselors' expertise is on counseling related mental health issues, right? And
Hmm.
it's hard enough for us just to like engage in legislative advocacy around those issues. So we really, I think it's important that we stay focused on the issues that we can really impact and speak to.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, you mentioned like that there is this divide and that it is really helpful to focus on what unites us more than what divides us. But any practical tips for navigating political conversations with clients or other counselors who maybe do differ in their political views?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to be respectful and kind and curious. Look, I've learned a lot by having conversations with people who think differently than I do, and we certainly can't facilitate the change process if we're angry or guarded or defensive or like certainly attacking, right? And sadly, that's where many of our political conversations go, right?
Mhm.
And so I think again, I would just go back to compassion, kindness, curiosity, um, and really speaking to issues that you know a lot about, right? Like what are those issues, right? Mental health, counseling, access to care issues, right? So I think to me that feels really important. But I find it's really hard because to have a conversation, you need both the people wanting to have a conversation
Right,
and not be defensive or guarded.
right.
But again, sadly, because of the divisiveness in our country right now, that's where these things often go. And I've been the recipient of that, and I've experienced that
Yeah.
firsthand. So I know how hard that can be.
Yeah, and I think that that speaks to one of the very, very fundamental like skills that we probably learned before coming becoming counselors, but that we hone in on really well when we get to techniques and start training. But listening, right? Yeah, yeah. That engages those qualities that you're talking about, like kindness and compassion and being curious. We have to be open to like hearing the other person.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. It's one of the things that's been interesting to me is, when you do legislative work, what you really quickly learn is um, legislators, look, they're going to lunch together, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. They're hanging out together. They're going to lunch. They're going to happy hour. They're friends. They're talking.
Hmm.
Right?
Hmm.
It's often the people out of the legislative process who tend to get more, more of like the shut off with people who don't think like they do, than even legislators do. And I think that's really humbling to me. Like it's just really important that we listen, that we stay connected, and we find common ground. How can we find common ground about the things that we really care about? And again, I really would like to see more counselors focus on counseling issues, right? Like sometimes I think we can get caught up in a lot of the other issues that we can't speak as eloquently to as counseling issues. So I'd really like to encourage all of us to use our voices to advocate for counselors and those we serve.
Love that. And this is a question that we tweaked a little bit because we do ask on every episode, but wanted to speak specifically to political engagement, this election and voting. But the name of the podcast is Ohio Counseling Conversations. What conversations do you think that counselors should be having with each other when it comes to this election or voting in general?
Yeah, I think what like in terms of voting, who are the politicians that support mental health issues, whether it's supporting issues that we care about as counselors or serving the people that we serve and their mental health needs. But I think just as important part of the conversation is how do we as counselors unite to engage in the legislative process after the election?
Hmm.
How do we do that? It's just not enough to show up and vote. It's
Right.
important, but it's just not enough to support the health of our profession and keep access to care. How do we globally engage with all counselors? Many people may not know the Ohio Counseling Association has a counseling pack, and it's really important that we donate to that. Look, people who organizations that are healthy and strong have strong counseling packs and they donate to those, and that money is used then as part of the legislative process. So it's a little icky, right? It feels a little bit like, oh, giving money to make donations to campaigns. But if it's serving our profession and serving those who we serve, it's really important. So I would
Mhm.
encourage people to consider donating to that or getting involved with OCA. And just look, I haven't mentioned this, but just getting involved in professional service is really an important way to be involved. So OCA has a government affairs committee. So if you want to get involved, how do you get involved with that committee? How can you support the work that OCA, the American Counseling Association, Chi Sigma Iota, NBCC, how can we support the work that they're doing to elevate our profession? So I think just more than getting involved in the election is how do we get involved all the time?
Same question. The idea about having these types of political conversations about voting or political engagement with our clients. Can you tell us, like, maybe what kinds of conversations you would have with them or the communities that we serve?
Yeah, I think it's something that we need to be thoughtful about in terms of approaching clients around political conversations. I think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and people can't engage in a higher level political process if they don't have food in their belly. So,
Mhm.
you know, many of our clients struggle with economic security. They struggle with food security. They struggle with things like having a roof over their head, having electricity. I think it's
Mhm.
really tone deaf to encourage a client to go engage in the political process if that's not where their head is, if that's not something that they're thinking about, and if they don't have their basic needs met and see that as a priority. Look, as counselors, we hold a tremendous privilege. We we come from a place of relative economic security. Um, Theoretically, most of our basic needs are being met, and that's not always the case for many of our clients. And so we need to really check that privilege and be aware that our clients may not have the bandwidth or ability or interest in engaging in the
Mhm.
political process. So for us to encourage them to do that when they're struggling just to get through the day, I think is really is insensitive, and it makes things more about us and less about them, right? So I do think the personal is political. I know that everything impacts every political decision impacts us and the people that we serve. But at the same time, as counselors, we know we need to be meeting people where they're at. So if
Right.
a client is, part of where they're at is a place of wanting to engage in advocacy, whether personal advocacy, legislative advocacy, yeah, absolutely. Let's talk with them about that. What does that look like for them? In what ways do they want to get involved? How can we work with them to help them find some resources they can use to connect and get involved? I think that's really powerful, but we really need to be reading where our clients are at.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. And making sure those fundamental needs are there before we could ever get to these higher level, maybe actions with advocacy in their own personal or political
Yeah, and is
lives.
that
Yeah,
something that our clients want? Not all of our clients may
right.
want to engage in the political process, and, that's okay. I don't think that it's our job to push them to do that if that's not something that they're engaged in, because what we know what's gonna happen is they're not gonna come back to counseling. If we're pushing them to do something that's not consistent with their view of their change process, it's counterproductive to the development of a healthy working alliance, right? So we need to figure out what is our client's, construction of how the
Yeah.
change process works, and is political engagement part of that for them? For some of our clients, it will be, but for some of them, it won't be, and we really need to be sensitive to that.
Hmm. Yeah, accepting that and recognizing that it is part of our journey as a counselor to meet them and meet their needs,
Yes.
not our own.
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Okay, I love that. Yeah. So switching gears sort of away from some of that, but I think some of it will still be here just because of your own professional journey. You've been recognized very well as one of like the top producers and publishers in a lot of the counseling journals over the past couple decades. And could you share a little bit more with us, just some of the research topics that you're most proud of, and especially how they've influenced the field?
Yes, well, thank you. Yes, I would love to talk about this. Before I jump in, though, one caveat I have, and one thing I say to people that I work with and mentor is I think it's really valuable to dig in on one area and really study and research and explore and unpack an area or two. I am very curious and I tend to have a very short attention span and I get bored easily. And so my career, I've really jumped around a lot. And if I could go back, I might have tried to have focused in and become a bit more granular. That said, I don't know that I would do anything different. But what happens for me is very often I get passionate or excited about something or I get curious about it. And a lot of how I learn is by researching. And so I've really jumped around and had my hands in a lot of different pots because I just love to learn. When I was early in my career in the mid '90s, I worked with children who had been severely traumatized. They had all been physically abused, neglected. Many of them had been sex trafficked as children, and I became very interested in self-injury, non-suicidal self-injury, because so many of my kiddos were engaged in this behavior and I didn't know how to help them. And I didn't really understand what it was about because back then nobody did. Nobody was looking at this,
Mhm.
talking about it. I had never even heard of this behavior. And I found that the folks around these kids were really not responding in helpful ways. What was happening is providers were getting personally activated and they just wanted them to stop the behavior and they engaged in attempts to control the behavior that I thought were really unhelpful. They because of their own issues, their personal reactions to the behavior would get angry, frustrated, annoyed with the children, and I really saw the self injury as as a trauma response. And so I really got passionate about how can we approach people who self-injure from a humanistic perspective? How can we approach them from a compassionate perspective, a kind perspective? And how can we help them? How can we help facilitate their change process in a humane way? And so I really have written a lot and dedicated a lot of my career to trying to educate people about self-injury, why people do this, how we can engage them in a way that we minimize power struggles and facilitate their change process. So I feel proud of being a voice of advocacy for this population. I also have done a lot around diagnosing, using the DSM to diagnose. And I've talked a lot about the complexities associated with diagnosing, a lot of the limitations associated with the use of the DSM in diagnosing, a lot of the ethics issues associated with how we diagnose, the diagnostic process. It shocks me that so few people other talk about this, but it's so far from a science, and there's so many validity and reliability issues associated with diagnosis that we don't talk about. We kind of treat it like it's this it's very black and white. And in fact, how we use the diagnosis and the DSM itself is far from black and white, and it's continually evolving. So I
Mm.
feel again, I feel good about those conversations. I One of the things that I've really written a lot about that I think is so important is our profession's focus on wellness and strengths and health, mental health. Um, Yet we diagnose and treat, right? So in order to get paid, we
Mhm.
have to diagnose and treat, which is this medical model, psychopathology kind of clinical psychology, right? Type of way of thinking about
Right.
people. But yet we have a health focus. And so one of the things I've written a lot about in my career is how do we bridge that gap? How can we
Mhm.
retain our identity as counselors, yet also do what we have to do, which is think about psychopathology and diagnose and come up with treatment plans, right? So I've, I have a book treating those with mental disorders where I talk about evidence-based approaches and the value of those, but I also talk about the importance of a strength-based focus, a mental health focus, about a developmental focus, about a trauma-informed focus. So I feel good about, we have to have this psychopathology conversation, but how do we do that in a way that we also make space for mental health, right? I
Yes.
also
Yeah.
am really, really passionate about counseling children and adolescents. I actually went into this profession because of my passion for child abuse and child abuse advocacy and trauma informed practices. And I find that as a profession, we could do a better job of training our counselors on how to work with youth. Most counselor
Mhm.
educators don't have experience with youth counseling, and most of how we train our students is this assumption that they're going to be working with adults who want to be there. So we don't
Right.
talk about working with youth who are brought there because they're forced to come typically, and they may not even understand counseling for developmental reasons, or just they just don't get why they're there and what that's about. And so I'm really curious about how we can do a better job training new generations of counselors to work effectively with youth. I think this is really,
Mhm.
really important. And so I have a counseling textbook on counseling children and adolescents, where a lot of it is I talk about things that I wish I had known when I was becoming a counselor, that I just didn't know. Look, like many counselors, found myself working with kids, and I had no idea what I was doing. I had no training in it. I had never had a single class on working with families or children. And I was
Mhm.
learning through supervision at my agency how to do this. And I just think it's so important that we really push ourselves to do better here. So those are a few of the areas. I've really gone all over. I've written a lot of different things. So those are a few of the areas I'm really
Mhm. Yeah,
proud
it
of.
speaks to some of the experiences you've had as a professional in the field too, and that drove you to learn more. Like you said, that you were interested, so you researched it and found out more to share and have shared with the rest of us. So thank you for your service professionally to to us as well. Um, I know that you've done some training in East Africa, like helping other professionals train for mental health practice there. Can you speak about like challenges or opportunities you've encountered when you've been working internationally?
Yes, I feel so fortunate to have had the opportunity to do work in East Africa. When I was in high school, my dream was always to join the Peace Corps, and I still haven't given up on that. I hope someday I can still do that. But I was very fortunate to be provided with opportunities to do work in Malawi, Tanzania, Zambia, and Rwanda. And initially, I did some work there through the National Board of Certified Counselors, working with the United Nations UNESCO Center in Malawi, and I had the opportunity to do some work there with the Malawi government around educating them about counselor licensure, who counselors are, what we do, and working with the program that they had there and being a liaison there to the government and having some conversations that were really important conversations around education and mental health. And then I had the opportunity to work through NBCC as a mental health facilitator. So I did trainings with people there around becoming mental health facilitators, which is kind of like lay professionals within the community. So learning basic counseling skills and then going into their churches and their schools and their communities and applying those skills as lay paraprofessional counselors. And then I also had the opportunity to do some work in Rwanda around working with a company there that supports mental health in the workforce and mental health advocacy within the community. So most of my work there has been around education, understanding mental health issues, understanding why they're important, and creating a culture around mental health and mental health advocacy. So I feel so fortunate to have had those opportunities there. Um, I really it's really challenging in a lot of ways to do this kind of work in East Africa because there's not a cultural conception of mental health or different mental health advocacy issues like there is here in the United States. So there's not infrastructure there to support that, right? So there aren't school counselors, for example. I was involved in Rwanda with the first agency that provided community counseling and helping them, develop their policies and things around that. Like, so this is very like ground level. Things are just getting off the ground and getting
Mhm.
started there. So there's a lot of challenges there. Um, just the understanding of things like, for example, I was working in a village and talking about things like autism spectrum. So there were some children who were on the spectrum, and there was no understanding of what that is or what that looks like or what that means, right? So people create their own cultural ways, right, of trying to make sense of autism spectrum and what that is and what it means and how to approach it, which is very different from our understanding of that here in the United States, right? So there are some challenges in that way, but there's also a lot of strengths that the culture has. So, I it's so delightful. It just warms my heart. It's so delightful to do education there because the people there love education. I've never experienced anything like it. It is such a privilege for them to learn, to get education, and they're so hungry for it. Like, when I do trainings, people are there an hour early. They're ready. They're sitting down. They have their pencil. They are ready to take notes. They hang on every word you say. There's no getting tired or fatigued. There's no after lunch, I'm tired and withdrawn. It's like they're hanging on every word you say. They're so grateful for the education. There's such a love of learning. There's such a curiosity. There's so many questions. When I do trainings, I'm there for hours after the trainings because everybody wants to ask you questions and they want to engage and they want to learn more. And there's also this collectivist community piece that's really exciting. I mean, people really care about their community. They want to touch their community. They want to make their community better, and it's really they want to take what they're learning and figure out how to help people. There's not like this, in America globally, we tend to be more individualistic, right? Like, how does this help me? And I love the collectivist sense of community that you get there. So it really feels like the work that you do is look, it's hard, it's challenging. The cultural barriers can make cross-cultural education difficult, but
Mhm.
it's so invigorating and so exciting. And my work in East Africa, I always say, like, Africa's given me so much more than I could ever give. It's just been such a privilege, and it's changed everything about me personally and professionally in such important ways, and I'm so grateful to have had the privilege of
Yeah.
working there.
Sounds like an amazing experience. And all of your experiences in your career have really earned you a lot of recognition because of your advocacy, your leadership, scholarship, community service, and even mentorship initiatives. Is there a particular area or achievement that you're most passionate about or that you hope to focus on in the future?
Yes, thank you for asking this. I went into counseling because I wanted to advocate for children, youth who are being abused. And particularly, I'm very interested in child sexual abuse. And I really wanted to bring trauma and developmentally informed practices into counselor training. And that's why I did this. My first love is actually sociology. I was a sociology major, and I was really passionate about sociology. But I really wanted to get close to children and communities and help them engage in more trauma informed practices. And what happened, Marissa, was like I got into counseling and I found myself in a profession that needed advocacy. So I went into
Mm,
this profession to advocate for youth. But when I got into counseling, I realized I couldn't advocate for youth if we couldn't be reimbursed by insurance companies, if we couldn't
mhm,
get Medicare reimbursement, if we couldn't have our place at the table. And so I found myself spending, the last 3 decades advocating for the counseling profession. And
yeah.
now I feel like we're stabilized. We're where we need to be, although there is still so much work to be done. We cannot let up. We can't put the brakes on. But that said, what I would like to do as I round out my career over the next decade or two is really go back to focusing on youth and advocacy for youth, especially abused children. So I'm really playing with this idea of childism. So we talk about ableism, we talk about racism, we talk about sexism, right? We talk about all these isms, but we don't talk about um, childism. We don't talk about the fact that in America and throughout the globe, throughout our planet, children are second class citizens in all cultures. They don't
Mhm,
have voice, they don't have representation, they don't have people advocating for them. And I'm really curious about how in all of our systems, in counselor education, in the counseling profession, in community agencies, in schools, how can we give children more voice? How can we give them
mhm,
more agency? How can we support their autonomy? How can we give them voice? How can we advocate for those among us who have the least power and voice? Children.
mhm,
And
mhm,
certainly there is an intersectionality there in terms of thinking about this topic that is so important. So when we think about children of color, when we think about children with disabilities, uh, there's this intersection. But this is also true of all children in all societies throughout the globe are second class citizens. And I really want us to challenge ourselves to think about that. And that's something that I'd really like to do more of as we move forward. And that's something I really wanna dedicate myself to as I round out my career.
I love that. And I think it just speaks to us expanding our knowledge and cultural understanding of different groups, right? And so that's really a cool piece to continue developing and understanding. Thank you, everyone, for tuning into this episode of Ohio Counseling Conversations, which touched on a number of important conversation topics to attend to as counselors in Ohio. Due to technical issues, we couldn't bring you the entire conversation, but rather a substantial amount, and hope that it was still impactful. Thank you for your understanding, and we hope to see you at AOCC.
Ohio Counseling Conversations is on a mission to make this podcast meaningful to you, and we can't do that without your help. A feedback form is linked in the show notes for this episode and is also available on the OCA linktree. If you have any recommendations for topics or guests or any other general feedback, you can let us know by using the form. We welcome your thoughts so that we can continue to develop the podcast and grow as creators. If you are interested in joining the team or being a guest, you can also reach us by emailing ohiocounselingconversations@gmail.com. We value your insight. Thank you so much for listening.
If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to follow us so you can stay up to date with Ohio Counseling Conversations online and wherever you listen to podcasts.
This podcast is brought to you by the Ohio Counseling Association's Media, Public Relations, and Membership Committee and its podcast subcommittee. This podcast features original music selections by Elijah Satoru-Wood and our closing song, Accretion Discotheque by Who A.D. Views, beliefs, or references mentioned in this episode do not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by the Ohio Counseling Association. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the podcast does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Views and opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect the view of the Ohio Counseling Association or any of its officials. Thank you.